predicting the second round of 2023 redraft fantasy football leagues. That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find my newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. Tons of new stuff there for you guys. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his fantastic work at RotoViz, where he is doing tons of stuff, where the RotoViz crew is doing tons of stuff. Make sure you're subscribed there as well. And Shawn, I guess we could do a quick recap of the first round from our last show. We talked through having the same 5 players in our top 5 for 2023 redraft leagues. Slightly different order. You went Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Jonathan Taylor, Kyle Pitts, and McCaffrey. I started with McCaffrey again in 2023, then went Jonathan Taylor, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson. A little flip there on Chase and Jefferson from where you had them, and Pitts at 5. Again, we are doing tight end premium for our scoring for this exercise. The rest of your first round was DeAndre Swift, Cooper Kupp, Breece Hall, Javonte Williams, Travis Etienne, CeeDee Lamb, and Saquon Barkley. The rest of my first round was Javonte Williams, Cooper Kupp, Saquon Barkley, Breece Hall, DeAndre Swift, CeeDee Lamb, and A.J. Brown. The one player from your first round that did not make it into my first round was Travis Etienne. The one from my first round that didn't make it into yours was A.J. Brown. Talked a little bit about Etienne on the last show. Didn't really get a chance to talk about Brown, but we'll have both those guys coming up in our second rounds here. That was a recap of the last show. Listen to our whole explanation of all of that on the other show. But today we're going to start at the 201 and talk through what we think the second round of the 2023 redraft landscape will be.
And in some ways, this gets to be even a little bit trickier and or more controversial, because in the second round, if you start to leave out the big names, then you're sort of planting the flag on what you think these guys actually are going to do in 2022. So we'll see who falls perhaps entirely from the first round into the third. I mean, a player who lands in the third round of the 2023 draft is still obviously a very good player, but if you have been a consistent first round pick for a while and don't make this exercise, that's at least actual intel in terms of what you and I think are going to happen. It was kind of interesting, kind of fun to go through the first round and the first 5 picks and see that when we have done our live draft shows and we have the 104, I've been fighting for Jamar Chase and you've been fighting for Justin Jefferson. And then we did our 2023 projection. We had them flipped. So I like that part of it. It is one of the reasons why it can be fun to go through this and look a year ahead. We talked in the first episode of why we think this exercise is valuable. Ben, I know we want to get to the players. So let's just jump right in here. You still don't have Travis Etienne. So you are missing a guy. I don't have A.J. Brown in the first couple of picks here, but we both have Mark Andrews as the 201. I was kind of looking to push Andrews further down, but in tight end premium, it's just almost impossible. Again, the advantage of those high-scoring tight ends is so severe. One of the things I enjoyed about our projection show and working through that with you was your discussion of how you think that the pass volume will basically be in the middle, right? It's not going to be either the 2021 season, which was very pass heavy, or the 2019 and 2020 seasons that were extraordinarily run heavy. But almost either way, this passing game is going to be so concentrated between Andrews and Rashad Bateman that the target volume for Andrews will be there. I mean, his efficiency numbers, you can always have a bad season. You can get dinged up a little bit and don't have the explosiveness. And then, you become a little bit more of a decoy. Maybe you don't run after the catch as well. But barring something like that, I mean, when Mark Andrews is targeted, he's going to be efficient. It's just almost impossible to push him below the 201.
Yeah, I mean, you described the ways that players can have down seasons statistically, and yet over his 4 years, his targets per out run have been great every year. His yards per target have been great every year. His touchdown rate has been above average every year. He's good at football. The other element with the passing rate that you mentioned is the routes, right? And he not only saw more routes last year because of increased pass volume, but because his percentage of dropbacks that he was getting out into routes was way higher. He had always been sort of a part-time guy in that regard, and he was running routes on almost every play. They have restocked the tight end position a little bit. Isaiah Likely looking really good in the first preseason game. It's possible that he's not running quite as high of a route share this year per drop back, that they cut that back a little, that last year was more of a necessity thing, and they are back to a little bit more of a rotation. But he's going to keep some of those gains. I don't think we see him fall all the way back to where he was in his first couple of seasons. And so even if their pass volume comes back, his routes don't go back to where they were in his first, second, or third year. They come back some, but they, to put numbers on this, his career high was 350 through his first 3 years. He was up over 600 last year. I'm guessing he's in the 500 to 550 range, either by the team passing less or a little bit lower of a route rate in terms of the percentage of dropbacks, but well above still the 350 that was his career high earlier. And at his efficiency, I mean, he's going to have a good year. I'm right there with you that he's in tight end premium. Sort of impossible to drop, outside the first 20 picks, certainly. And we both have him here at 13. The next name at 202 is interesting because I have a guy that you have fallen completely out of your list. You have a guy that listeners will not be surprised to see in J.K. Dobbins, and I have him at 205. So we both have Dobbins. Again, this feels like the DeAndre Swift from last year, where I very openly said I was kind of just tailing the guy that you've been excited about all offseason in this 4th, 5th round range, being a 1st or 2nd round pick the next year. You've talked a lot about Dobbins. Do you want to defend this 202 even more? Me having him at the 205, I'll just say, is because I knew Shawn would have him even higher.
No, I mean, I think that this is a good spot for him. I think because he's not going to be a guy who catches 80 passes or has a receiving EP in that 8.0 range. This is almost the ceiling in terms of where he can go. I mean, you would need to have a Derrick Henry type of year, or kind of the campaign that I hinted at, where he is like a Jamal Charles or Barry Sanders with Lamar Jackson. J.K. Dobbins was extraordinary as a rookie. He probably isn't going to be at that same level, at least for the first half of the season. I mean, they're hoping he's ready for week 1. He's kind of practicing off to the side. It sounds like he could get in a little bit more. Maybe by the time the show releases, he'll be doing a little bit more of that. The second half of the season, he should look really, really good. And that, I think, will lead into 2023. The other thing that's just kind of interesting, they don't have a clear-cut situation behind him, which I think could help him some. If Gus Edwards were healthy and really good, maybe you actually would split it, 55-45. And then not only do you not catch passes, but you're not getting the overall workload that maybe you need. If Mike Davis were more talented, the interesting thing about the preseason game, and I've been kind of, trying to ignore this because, I fall in love with Justice Hill every year and then it is completely and totally irrelevant, but he looked good in the preseason. I mean, if their next best player at the running back position is basically J.K. Dobbins, but, smaller and not quite as talented, then again, I think that actually favors J.K. Dobbins, right? So especially the second half of 2022, I think will go well. And I have him one spot ahead of Austin Eckler, which obviously is suggesting that Eckler will be good, because you don't stay at the 203 if you're not still good, but that as the season goes along, I think that they're going to have some volume going to some other backs.
Yeah, and I probably should have had Eckler in my first 2 rounds, but I just dropped him out entirely. You're already 27. What's that?
You're going with the full fade here.
I'm going with the full fade. He's already 27 back in May. Not necessarily a big back. Very efficient last year with the 20 touchdowns, particularly being the big mark of efficiency. I think if we're talking about a 28-year-old Austin Eckler coming off a year that doesn't look like his 2021, maybe it's still a very good year, but 2021, he catches 70 balls, he has 1,500 yards, he has 20 touchdowns. Say it's a 1,300-yard year, say he catches, 60 or 70 balls, but not as dominant, I guess, in the receiving game, say his touchdowns fall to 12 or 13, I think it's pretty easy to say that he would not necessarily be a second-round pick. Maybe he would. Maybe that was a little bit unfair on my part, but I dropped Eckler completely out. Again, some of that is related to age. I was going to say he might look a little bit like Aaron Jones does this year at age 28 if he has another good year like that. And Jones is going in the second round. So maybe I'm a little bit too firm on what his drop will be. But you also dropped him into the second round.
I did. And in the first show, we mentioned that Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook, how they perform actually could affect some of the older backs. You mentioning Aaron Jones, I think is interesting because how he performs could influence what drafters do with Austin Eckler, who not this year, but next year could be in a similar circumstance. One of the things that you've priced in probably more accurately than I have is the potential for them to actually add a back that matters next year. Whereas one of the things that I'm thinking by moving into 203 is that it's almost, I mean, it's going to be difficult for him to have a healthy season that doesn't kind of still put him in this range, kind of the fall that we're seeing from Cook and Kamara. Eckler is kind of in that position to have that type of fall next year. I think it would be different if Isaiah Spiller had been, one of the players who was generating buzz in camp, but he kind of falls in that 25% where, it's everybody either looks fantastic or terrible right now. People are not happy with where Spiller is. If he's not going to be the backup, then, Eckler's going to touch the ball a ton. So I think the production will be there to keep drafters excited, but he's already said he doesn't want to touch it as much. When you're talking about 2023, they almost have to come up with some plan to make that a committee.
And that's the other thing I didn't mention, but definitely a consideration for me that I think they will, whether Spiller is good this year at some point or they will add a back that is, because he'll be 28 at that point, and we'll be looking at Eckler as a little bit more of a rotational back. But yeah, to your point is exactly what I was thinking with Aaron Jones, where, if he has an AJ Dillon there, people are still treating Aaron Jones. And if this Chargers offense looks as good as the Packers do, people are still treating Aaron Jones as a second rounder this year. That could very well be the case next year. So again, not super firm on my decision to drop Eckler all the way out, but part of it, as you noted, is something that doesn't necessarily affect his 2022, but could his 2023 is what happens in the offseason at their running back position behind him. So that's your first three picks of the second round: Andrews, Dobbins, Eckler. Mine were Andrews, Travis Kelce. That's the player you dropped out. And then Travis Etienne, who we talked about a little bit on the last show. You had at the 110. I have at the 202. I can definitely see him being a first rounder next year. I guess I'm a little concerned right now with him, but I'll probably come back around. He's the exact type of profile we want to be targeting. Talk a little bit about Kelce, I guess. I've made the argument recently that he had the stinger last year. Even with that, his regular season numbers, he played 16 games. They were way clear of every other tight end not named Mark Andrews. It was about 30 points shy of Andrews, and I think it's like 50 or 60 points ahead of everyone else. If you look at points per game, he was within a point of Mark Andrews, and to me, 2021 was a Mark Andrews peak, right, in terms of routes, in terms of everything. He was 2 points per game or more higher than the tight end 3 and every other tight end at the position. Even as he wasn't as productive, Kelce, during the regular season, he went on to be very productive in the playoffs, average basically 100 yards per game. He had 299 yards over 3 games, averaged 9 targets per game, 7.7 catches, scored 3 touchdowns. When he was healthier, that stinger had kind of worn off. He could certainly still fall off this year, though. He's 33. My guess is we see another really good Travis Kelce season. I still have him as my tight end 1. You seemed a little bit more concerned. Is that really what it is? If we don't see that season, that it's going to be tough for drafters at age 34 to be taking him this high?
Yeah, I think once you get into your mid-30s, you've had to just absolutely annihilate the previous season to maintain those levels. Now, with tight end being so shallow, it could be a little bit different. And also, when you have established such a long stretch of dominance, it's not like he's popped out for, like you mentioned, a great Mark Andrews type of season. He's been the best of the best for a long time. That may give him a little bit more room to work with in terms of how good this year would have to be to maintain that level. I do still think that he's a good pick at the 1-2 turn in tight end premium this year. Obviously, you're not going to get him if that's where you're targeting him because he is a little bit more expensive than that. The other thing I think, and I did believe this was evident even just in the fleeting moments that the first team played in the first preseason game, is that I just think the Chiefs are much deeper and better at wide receiver than they've been at any point. I mean, you're looking at guys like Demarcus Robinson already being released. I mean, Byron Pringle is not somebody who, makes any kind of contribution. Josh Gordon has again been completely invisible in camp. But Juju Smith-Schuster, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, McCole Hardman before this most recent groin injury had actually been performing okay, which is something I was pretty skeptical about. And then you have Sky Moore coming in there and looking like he can get open anywhere. That creates a lot of risk for Kelce because to separate the way he does, you have to have that elite talent level. You need to have the efficiency that comes with playing with a great quarterback, but you need to have a huge target share, that elite target volume. I just don't think it can be the same if they actually have a bunch of good receivers. They've also addressed some of these issues that they have at running back, where if Pacheco is who they seem to think he is, if McKinnon can stay healthy for a stretch, they've got multiple guys who can come in there. It doesn't rest on, whether or not Clyde Edwards-Helaire is good, which, I mean, it simply doesn't look like he's good, right? So having that depth really helps them. Now, I think that in some ways this argument was maybe easier to make 72 hours ago, before Hardman has a groin injury in practice, before Juju misses a couple of days with knee soreness, which is the very last thing you ever want to hear with him, before McKinnon, misses a day of practice again, I think with, more or less minor soreness. But it's a reminder that McKinnon and Smith-Schuster may not be able to maintain the level of performance that they can show in spurts. They just no longer have the same body. But Juju is the guy who was dominating Chiefs camp. I mean, if you have Juju Smith-Schuster with Patrick Mahomes, I don't know that the gap between a healthy Smith-Schuster and Tyreek Hill is even that great. But then you add in all of these other guys. And again, Sky Moore looks like, once he finally and firmly climbs into the starting role, it's just going to be dominant. So I think that when you consider the context for the Chiefs and what a player in their mid-30s has to do to justify a pick in the first 2 rounds, I think it's going to be a challenge.
This is a pretty big disagreement for us because I see that everything you just described as a positive for Kelce. I see it completely different. I don't think Marquez Valdes-Scantling
touchdown season.
What's that?
You think that these guys? I mean, so you're not scared about these guys challenging him for target,
here's what I think.
But you think that they could actually help the offense in a way that benefits even more.
Yeah, let me lay out sort of the favorable thing. I don't think Marquez Valdes-Scantling is a high volume player. He never has been. His career high is 5 targets per game. I think he's a good ancillary receiver. You mentioned all these things about Juju that I do agree with, that he can be good in spurts, but he's not going to necessarily be reliable. And I'm concerned about his body and where he's at this point. Sky Moore, I think, is going to be fantastic, especially late. But it might take a little bit of time. He's a rookie. But I see this depth as essentially making it more difficult on defenses to key on Kelce, where in the past they've been trying to stop Kelce and Hill, and that's it, basically. They're letting Byron Pringle run free half the time, and Kelce's still productive and has been still productive in that setup. But now he has, I think, more depth to draw away from him in a way that teams have to be more concerned about the 3rd and 4th weapon than they ever were. And yet he also gets the benefit of losing the single biggest and best target earner that he was playing with, that one other player. That's a huge downgrade to not have Tyreek Hill. I think he's the clear one and everyone else is behind him, but also providing more cover than he's ever had. And again, last year's numbers, I think, are basically good enough to be arguably to be the tight end 1 this year, depending on whether Pitts comes way up, because I think Andrews comes down this year, certainly from last year's numbers for a lot of the reasons we've discussed. And I don't think his regular season numbers were a good reflection of how good he was for the full season. Again, when you talk about him being a little bit banged up for a stretch in the middle of the year, having a couple, I think he had 3 games where he had 27 yards exactly right in that stretch. I mean, he had a couple of these poor games, and you go into the playoffs, he has 3 consistent, strong games. And if he's still that guy, I think he has a better year in 2022 than he had in 2021 in the regular season. Or there's a really pretty easy path to that, frankly. More targets, more production as well. if he's healthier, right? But the age is an issue, and everything you described is a concern. But I see it almost the exact opposite way. All of the changes in the offense in terms of how it impacts Kelce. He's my clear 106 in tight end premium. So that is a definite disagreement that we have. You talked about him as a 1-2 turn guy. You have your little smile there where you like this disagreement.
No,
you always love when we have these little disagreements.
I do, and I hope you're right, man. That'd be so awesome for the Chiefs and for Kelce. That'd be really, really cool. Jalen Waddle, Ben, he is the next guy.
Yeah, I got him at 204. You have him at 205. I'll let you talk about him. You have him ranked very high in your redraft ranks, I noticed. I'm very optimistic about him. We've talked about the potential for him to outscore Tyreek. I'm actually a touch higher than you because I think if he goes and does that, we both drop Tyreek out of our first 2 rounds. I think we're both sort of saying that's what happens here, is that Jalen Waddle is either as good as or better than Tyreek in a way that drafters are looking at it next year as if Waddle is the better bet at a younger age. I do have him 1 spot higher than you. That's in part because you're incredibly high on Drake London here at 204. We talked about him a little in the first show, and you gave a lot of praise for him there. Anyone who listened to the first show, and I assume most have, will know why you were so high on him. He did not make my top 24. But I don't think me being at 204 on Waddle and you being at 205 on Waddle is reflective of anything other than you being very high on London there. But what is the excitement about Waddle? And I mean, I feel like he could be even higher than this.
He could. And you look at what he did last season with 133 targets, but only at 7.5 yards down the field. Now, I mean, there's going to be an element where perhaps it's easier to demand those targets if you're barely having to run across the line of scrimmage to get open. But the combination of things that they can do with him, the fact that their offense projects to be much more dynamic this year, there's a little bit of a counterbalancing effect where obviously you have Tyreek Hill come in. If he weren't there, then Jalen Waddle would be going mid-2 this year, right? But the similar thing that we talked about in terms of Pitts and London, in a little bit the different ways we're looking at Travis Kelce, but I think that what you explained for Travis Kelce could also, in some ways apply here, where one of the concerns that you would have for a second-year breakout for someone like Waddle, who was so good as a rookie and has that elite speed, and having an element of your game that a defense is going to have so much trouble taking away regardless of what they do because it's intrinsic to you and your physical profile. For Tyreek Hill to be the guy that the defense in many ways is going to have to key on this next season, and for it looking like they may really de-emphasize Mike Gesicki, I mean, I wouldn't certainly write that in stone, but there have been some very discouraging reports and kind of whispers on that. We could be looking at this offense almost exclusively being Hill and Waddle, especially if Waddle is not the defensive focal point, but I think that could flip during the course of the season. I think he could be that good, but we're going to see the depth of target jump with him. We're going to see the potential for big plays. The upside is just so tantalizing when you think about those 2 guys together. They've both been very positive in the media about Tua. I think the biggest thing to take away from that is just that they're good teammates and that they're enthusiastic about this season. Obviously they're not the sources that you should be looking to as to whether or not you draft him in fantasy. But I think this offense can work, and I think it's going to be more centered around these 2 guys, even than the market thinks. And the market is relatively optimistic. Obviously, we're getting Hill in late 2 and Waddle in late 3. Even a mild secondary breakout this season, and I think it'll be hard for drafters to ignore Waddle in the early 2nd next year.
Yep, that is well put. Did you want to add anything on London from, kind of building off what we talked about last show?
Just that he looks like the guy, right? And I think that injury is very helpful from a fantasy perspective because I do think that his ADP was going to jump. And for him to have that one play and then be out and not be able to show what he's capable of, it helps maintain a price that gives you plenty of room to outperform this season. I mean, as excited as you and I are for rookies and for players with wide ranges of outcome, you still have to be getting the right price on it. I mean, if it's a wide range, but you're paying for the top end of it, then you lose in your fantasy drafts. So I think, I mean, it's bad for him. It's bad for the Falcons. It may be good for fantasy managers. I think that he is separating from the rest of this rookie group when you look at their practice reports and the context. Now you say, well, the context in Atlanta's passing offense may not be that good, but it's, I think, starting to be more difficult to be enthusiastic about Garrett Wilson with the Jets. It looks like Jameson Williams may not play till November. Chris Olave actually has a lot of target competition, and his quarterback is not healthy. Treylon Burks, just before we recorded this, I was seeing all these highlights of him make an extraordinary catch in a dual practice, but then evidently immediately getting hurt. And so that kind of, more or less takes away the enthusiasm you would have from that. Really, the rookie receivers who are outperforming are the late guys, the George Pickens, the Sky Moores, the Jalen Tolberts, the Romeo Doubs. And I think those guys will have good seasons, right? But Drake London looks like the guy who will have everything going for him in terms of production, draft pedigree, talent, a good situation in 2023. I think it's going to be hard for him not to be up there. Maybe this is enthusiastic, but I do think he's going to be
You've convinced me that I was wrong to not have him in the top 24. I've been in my wide receiver tiers over at Stealing Signals. I had been keeping him near the top of a tier that I was keeping Burks and Sky and Garrett Wilson at the bottom of, because I was telling myself they're all in the same tier. And before this show, either earlier today or yesterday or just very recently, I did finally, it was like I was kind of forcing that. I did finally move London into the higher tier where he's now in a group in my tiers, coming off the board in my ranks right after Juju, who we just talked about, right after Elijah Moore and the second year receivers that tend to go higher. I feel the same way, that he is separating from the other rookies, and finally was able to kind of realize that I was feeling that and do that in my tiers. But I'm right there with you. And I think I would say that I wish that I had him in my top 24 after that case. I think he made a strong case. So your top 5 of the second round: Mark Andrews, J.K. Dobbins, Austin Eckler, Drake London, and Jalen Waddle. Mine was Andrews, Travis Kelce, Travis Etienne, who you had at 110, Jalen Waddle, and J.K. Dobbins at 205 for me, who again we talked about when we discussed at the 202 for you. The guy who we have not seen in your second round yet was my 112, A.J. Brown. I would like to speak to the manager. 3 straight seasons of yards per out run over 2.5. Still the wide receiver 4 the last I checked in dynasty leagues. Everyone acknowledges that A.J. Brown is an elite talent. It's going into a new situation where I think they're actually going to be a low-key, more pass-heavy team than people expect. I know you're very high on Devonta Smith. You joked on ship chasing last week that Devonta Smith is the receiver we need. I love Devonta Smith's price. I've drafted him a lot, actually more than A.J. Brown, just simply because he falls in this area of drafts where it's so easy to click on Devonta Smith. A.J. Brown is a superstar and is going to look like it, and he's going to get to actually run more routes. He has never run more than 406 routes, I think it is, in his career, through a mix of injuries and also some weird stuff Tennessee would do in situational spots when they would be so run heavy with Derrick Henry in the second halves of games. I think if he stays healthy all year, he's going to be closer to a 100% route guy in every game. And his routes numbers are just going to explode this year. And similar to what we saw from Mark Andrews last year, you already have this 2.5 yards per out run every year of his career element to his profile. People are going to be like, why did we rank A.J. Brown in the 3rd round at this time next year? You do have him at 207. So you see him rising from where he's been going this year to next year. Why is he not in your first round?
This is probably a little bit, and I know that a lot of listeners are like, why is Shawn trying to keep his enthusiasm in check? His whole deal is fun drafting and being optimistic. But I mean, you don't want to have 100% of AJ Brown. You don't want to have 100% of Deebo Samuel unless you figure out some excuses to knock them down. You could easily get to that point. I have Deebo at the 206, Brown at the 207. I have so much enthusiasm for these two offenses. I did write in my bold predictions that Trey Lance and Jalen Hurts were going to finish 1-2 in quarterback scoring. I loved seeing that first drive from the Eagles, although it did require a late hit out of bounds to keep it going on third down after they did not convert. Loved seeing that long connection from Lance to Danny Gray. Matt Spencer has been pushing him. He's one of our data gurus and draft gurus. It looks like the 49ers have probably hit on a wide receiver that gives them even more talent, which is both good for Lance and possibly a little bit bad for Samuel and Ayuk. Almost the only case you can make for Kittle and Samuel and Ayuk at this point is that, and this is something we've talked about, you look at from week 11 on last year, all three of them put up all pro level numbers in terms of anything on a per route basis. They're that good. I think this offense can be a little bit pass heavier than people think, just like with the Eagles. And yet, even with all of that, because on both teams, you have the potential, not the potential, I mean, both these quarterbacks are going to run, and then so many other good players. I guess I just don't know how early drafters are really going to feel comfortable taking them when you have to hit on crazy efficiency numbers to pay off those prices. And yet whatever level drafters are taking them at, I'm also going to be taking them at least that early to make sure I get my share, because Deebo Samuel and AJ Brown are there's a clear like top five, right? I don't even know if we put Cooper Kupp in there. We have to put Cooper Kupp in there. Top six, right? You have Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams, AJ Brown, and Deebo Samuel. I mean, those are the six superstars. I mean, you can only push them down so low. You're arguing for keeping them, well, specifically AJ Brown, higher than I am.
Yeah, and I don't have Deebo in my top two rounds. He was one I considered. I think your comparison of the 49ers and Eagles offenses is very on point. I mean, they're incredibly similar. We can sit here and draw all the comparisons we want. When we talked about Trey Lance and my excitement for him a couple of months ago, I talked very specifically about Jalen Hurts' rushing profile in terms of design runs and scrambles and how it could look a lot like that. You have AJ Brown and Deebo Samuel as the wide receiver one. You have Devonta Smith and Brandon Ayuk as the wide receiver two. You have Dallas Goedert and George Kittle as efficient, good tight ends. Probably advantage Eagles at wide receiver two, advantage Niners at tight end, but very just similar all the way around in the way that these passing games and offenses look. Lower volume, three clear targets, etc. You mentioned Danny Gray. You can make the same case about Quez Watkins as a really good fourth weapon for the Eagles. The difference for me is that Deebo was an 8th round pick last year, that AJ Brown has been viewed as so dominant throughout his career, and that if the less optimistic outcome does happen for the Niners, that drafters will bail on Deebo quicker, I think, even though he had 2 years to start his career, now 3 years of yards per out runs over 2, but not quite as strong as AJ Brown in that regard. Not up in the 2.5 range from my recollection. I'd have to look that back up, but I'm pretty confident that's the case with Deebo. That there's not as long-term of a buy-in probably is reflected in their dynasty prices. And then the other element is the thing that I talked about with Lance and why it's such a good year to be on him is that we do see the quarterbacks that run less over multiple years. And part of the reason I'm excited about the Eagles is that people probably aren't baking in enough that Jalen Hurts has now started 20-plus games at the NFL level, which is a lot different than going into last year having started 6 or whatever it was. Lance is on the, I've only started a couple games track where more of that becomes rushing production, I think. More of it becomes scrambles. The readouts that the offense is, giving him on passing plays are going to be more limited. They're not putting additional layers typically until, or at least that's what the data shows. It's what it shows with different guys, like, Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. His scramble rates and design run rates have fallen over multiple years. Still very high for Jackson, not like a concern or anything, but I think there's this possibility that Hurts is ready to then take a little bit more of a step forward as a passer this year, and that offense is ready to be a little bit more pass heavy, whereas the Niners are still in that first year starter element that the Eagles were in last year, and they're going to look more. So that's one way that I would slice the difference between the two. I could be wrong there, but that's why I think there's more upside and optimism for the Eagles passing game and for AJ Brown than for Debo, and why I think drafters might not buy into Debo as much if he does have that tough year volume-wise, being the multiple year thing. But I think it makes a lot of sense that you have them back-to-back, and it makes less sense that I have A.J. Brown at 112 and Debo not even in my second round, to be honest, because they are so similar.
No, I think that some of those points are fantastic, and I love the way you're thinking about that. They're just kind of on a silly side note. Not that this doesn't matter, because obviously you're getting really cool information from beat reporters and other folks who are covering the teams. When I was looking at AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, some of these guys, Jalen Hurts, trying to make sure that I was high enough without being silly, I came across a practice report card essentially for Jalen Hurts that was giving like up, down, and neutral for every day of camp. And I'm before I look at the first one, I'm like, this is just going to be up, 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 up. But it was like up, down, neutral, etc. I'm like, I want it to be up every single practice, and think that this Eagles offense is going to be a passing juggernaut. Devontae Smith is back at practice now, at least unless he's gotten injured between our recording and our release. Hopefully that helps Hurts also. However it works out, you and I are going to have a lot of exposure to those three main players. The two players that you have in the exact same stretch where I have Debo and AJ Brown are interesting, because mostly this exercise is looking at like, how are the aging players going to fall? How are the young players going to rise? But you have two potential peak guys here in DJ Moore and Chris Godwin. Godwin, a player who has been already the wide receiver 2, the overall wide receiver 2. He's someone who is not quite as old as people may think, because he came into the NFL really young. Obviously, DJ Moore, one of your favorites, and now has a competent NFL quarterback to go with the elite peripherals that he always brings to the table. Those peripherals, at least to an extent, are based on having an elite talent level to where he both gets open, catches the ball well, can run after the catch. Godwin going to play well enough in the second half. DJ Moore going to fight off, a mini comeback from Robbie Anderson. I mean, is this the true level for these guys and where they should be going if kind of the weirdness that has surrounded these teams finally goes away?
Right. That's the way I would describe it. I think you put that very well. It is really interesting, just real quick, to step back and look at our boards. At 206 and 207, we have 4 different receivers, two different ones each, and the other person doesn't have either of those receivers in their second round. In the case of Debo and AJ Brown for you, I have AJ Brown at 112, Debo out. You don't have DJ Moore or Godwin in your top 24 here. You do have DJ Moore as the first that you listed. I don't know if you necessarily ranked them, but the first that you listed in your misses. I think you put that very well. I mean, I think everyone knows how I feel about DJ Moore. The targets per out run were through the roof last year. The yards per target was really poor. One of the big elements that I noticed when I wrote up my offseason stealing signals for the Panthers was, even though DJ Moore's yards per target were really bad at 7.1, they were like the best on his team for anyone who had any real volume. Robbie Anderson, we know, was astronomically terrible in yards per target.
Were his numbers in the negative?
They may have been. I think it was like 4.7 or something. Terrace Marshall had that rookie year that we're all just not even – he's dead to us. And for a lot of people, he was the number 2 receiver in the class last year. He was in the like 4.9 range. Tommy Tremble led the team in tight end targets. He was, I think, 5.1 yards per target. These guys that got volume, their second and third receiver and their top tight end, were all significantly worse than DJ Moore. It's not just that Sam Darnold was bad. Cam Newton was horrible when he took over for Darnold. And PJ Walker, who I've always loved, did not play well last year either. Their quarterback play was terrible. So DJ Moore's 7.1 yards per target can almost be looked at as a slight positive. Let's just say it probably makes him a Hall of Famer in relation to what the other players in his passing game were able to do. And the reason that's most notable, though, is he was very positive in yards per target and after the target efficiency prior in his career. All 3 seasons shows explosiveness in some of the rushing touches that he's got in his career. And then last year, the yards per target fell off while the targets per run rose. We saw the breakout target earning season from DJ Moore. Didn't have the efficiency to go with it. If you buy my case that efficiency has to come back to his mean, and I think his mean is above average. Rather than a league average, DJ Moore's average, because he's a yards after the catch player, because of what his skill set is. And if you buy that he can carry some of that targets per run gain forward, even with Christian McCaffrey back in the offense, you're talking about the whole package now. You're talking about him putting it all together in one season where he's earning the volume and he's efficient on the volume. That DJ Moore season's been coming. We've talked about it a bunch. I think we see it this year. I think people buy in. He's a second-round pick. And then with Godwin, it's exactly what you said. It's late season. I think he's going to be that good. I've said kind of all offseason, if he was fully healthy, I'd be taking him 2 rounds ahead of Mike Evans at least, I think. And I think we're going to see Mike Evans fall off a little bit. You and I have talked some about that. We're still thinking that the people have anchored too much to his pre-Julio Jones signing price and pre-positive Chris Godwin news price, where he was going in the second round. He was the wide receiver 7. He's now going typically in the 3rd round. You've said he's probably a 4th rounder. I'm right with you. I don't think he should be going in the 3rd round right now when Godwin looks like he might play week 1. And even if he doesn't, the reports are good enough that he's going to play by week 4 or 5, right? So you get a couple weeks of Mike Evans, but this idea that you're going to get half a season of Mike Evans dominating targets, it's just not going to come to fruition, especially now with Julio Jones in that offense. And as you wrote so well, Julio and Evans' numbers almost indistinguishable last year on per route basis, on a market share basis in those offenses they were in. Evans had more competition, but Julio's targets per run was actually higher than Evans and has been most years. It's a little older, but he's a really good player. He might be essentially on par with Evans at this stage of their respective careers. But I think late season, we're going to see Godwin look like the clear number 1 for the future of Tampa. Tom Brady was somebody, does he retire finally? That I was considering, what do we do here with Godwin as a community if Brady is not their quarterback anymore? But I do think we're going to be in a position where like Godwin's Tampa Bay's number 1 for the future.
And I traded Waddle for Godwin. Swift and Naji Harris also involved in that trade. Obviously, Swift coming my way. I don't regret that trade at all, even though the injury does obviously push it, I think, in the direction of the other manager. But I do think that Godwin is that good. I guess I might have some concerns about where 2023 goes for the Buccaneers.
Yeah.
What 2022 goes, the Buccaneers are now the weirdest team in football, right? With Tom Brady not there. A lot of their receivers, it sounds like, are a little bit dinged up. But when they've been out there, the practice reports for both Russell Gage and Julio Jones have been glowing. In which case, again, it could very easily be wrong on this, because in a high volume passing offense with a still elite quarterback and a player the level of Mike Evans, it's very easy that he could pull off that 2nd round price. But I do think there's a lot of risk there for the reasons you mentioned. Our next 2 players are identical.
Yeah. Instead of the 2 prior, where neither of us had the other's players in their 2nd round, we have the next 2 in the exact same slot.
And those guys are T. Higgins and Stephon Diggs. Probably not huge surprises there. We like this price for T. Higgins. I think that next year is going to be the same as this year for Higgins, both in terms of what his floor is, what his upside is, what the scenarios are. I think that drafters are going to be more comfortable taking him at that range next year, where you can still actually get him sliding around into the 3rd round this year. Both of those guys have big numbers. Joe Burrow sort of consolidates the second half of the season. So I don't think that one is too tricky at all. Even if Jamar Chase were to get hurt and not have the season that you and I are projecting, unless there's some very unfortunate situation in which Chase is not 100% for 2023, then it's difficult to take T. Higgins too much earlier, but it's also difficult to take him too much later. So I guess I feel comfortable with that. A situation.
I agree completely. You said that perfectly.
A situation that could be similar, Ben, is there in Buffalo. I have Gabriel Davis 2 spots below Stephon Diggs.
That's what I was just going to highlight. That's the really fun part for you is for your rankings here is you have Stephon Diggs at 209. You have Gabriel Davis at 211. I love that. I definitely gave Davis a long consideration. I ultimately think Diggs is so good, but there's also some just age-related stuff where he's going to be a year older. I do have him obviously falling quite a bit from this year to next, even though I love him and have made the case for his upside being high enough to match the top 3 receivers, something we talked about in our, I think way back in our wide receiver episodes in early June, maybe, where you felt like at the end of the first round, those receivers maybe don't have the upside to catch those top 3. It is an interesting thought point when you have those late first round draft selections. For you, though, you're having Gabe Davis. I mean, he's the younger one, and you still have Diggs higher. So you're saying Diggs is probably going to be more productive this year, if I'm reading into this correctly. But you have Davis being so good that now we have 2 Bills receivers in the late second round.
And partly this offense and Josh Allen, I mean, almost makes it difficult for them to go much below that if they have the kind of season that we're expecting. I mean, the fact that Gabriel Davis is being drafted in the 4th round this year, I mean, more or less just presupposes that, I mean, he's got to be in the 2nd round next year. Maybe if he comes through with the 4th round value this year, you're going to have that jump because it confirms sort of what we're looking at. Everybody is on Gabe Davis. And so my ranking of him there is not unique, but I do think that his overall profile is fantastic. And this is one of those situations where the team just messed up. And so while he's not going to have that playoff game versus Kansas City every week, you're going to have some big games. You're going to have some solid games. One of a little bit below the radar stories from last year is that Josh Allen's accuracy dropped off a little bit again. And I almost think that Gabriel Davis is not as sensitive to that as Stephon Diggs. One of the things that we didn't get from Diggs last year was quite as many of the underneath completions and quite as much of the run after catch dynamism. Some of those things are more difficult if your quarterback is not hitting you where you can run appropriately after the catch. But when you're hitting a guy for a 70-yard touchdown because he's clear of the defense, then, I mean, again, you can miss those throws too. Tyreek Hill was constantly complaining about Patrick Mahomes missing him deep last year. And if Patrick Mahomes can miss you, then anybody can miss you. But I mean, Gabriel Davis with that size, with his ascending physicality, I mean, he's still super young too. I mean, he's one of these guys who came into the NFL, in that, not quite as young as Juju Smith-Schuster, but in that sort of Chris Godwin-ish range where, I mean, people are thinking of him as actually a slower build than what he's actually having, especially for someone who was picked where he was, and he should have been picked higher. So, I mean, when we think about some of these guys that you and I are really excited about, like Romeo Doubs, and then players like Jalen Tolbert that everybody is excited about, certainly players like Sky Moore and George Pickens. But, I mean, this is where Doubs and Tolbert, could be in a couple of years. The fact that we're thinking they could do it this year is probably less realistic.
Yeah, you got a kick out of me putting Romeo Doubs in my near misses, and I said to you, look, all he's got to be is Aaron Rodgers' number 1 receiver by the end of the year, and I'll take him in the 2nd round next year. I think you said that all really well on the Bills. One really interesting thing about, as you were saying that, I was kind of looking back at your full first 2 rounds. You talked about on the first episode, we haven't talked about here on the second episode, is how you have a lot more running backs early. You started your 2nd round with J.K. Dobbins at 202 and Austin Eckler at 203. So in your top 15 picks, you have 9 running backs. Your entire rest of the 2nd round is wide receivers from 204 through to the 212. 9 more picks, all are wide receivers. Diggs and Gabe Davis there at 209 and 211. You have Devonta Adams at 210. Probably doesn't need too much explanation. We don't think I have him at 212 or my co-212 because I had actually accidentally left out CeeDee Lamb. You caught that right before the show, and I didn't want to drop my other 212 out of my rankings, so I did a co-212 that includes Devonta Adams, who had previously been 211 when I didn't have CeeDee Lamb even in my ranks. But you have Diggs, Adams, Gabe Davis, and then Jerry Jeudy as your last player. I have Diggs, a running back, but that is my only running back after J.K. Dobbins, who, again, you had at 202, and ETN is the other one that I had in the second round at 203. You had him in the first round. So similar on the running backs that we have and having them in the first round, in the first part of the second round. You had Eckler. I mentioned not dropping him all the way out. The running back that I have at 210 is Naji Harris. You had dropped him all the way out. Probably surprising to many. Going into year 2, still some optimism. I think you have to be very concerned about the offensive line. I think you have to be concerned about the offense. I think you have to be concerned about the lack of explosive plays, either in the running game or in the passing game last year. Massive volume. Finishes as the RB3 as a rookie, and yet had 17.7 points per game, which isn't really that great, frankly. I mean, I think it's hard to draft Naji Harris this year at his price when we're talking about legendary upside being 25 points per game, at least 22 or 23 that you need out of an elite running back. Again, he was the RB3 last year, but that's because he played 17 games and he got 380 touches. 17.7 points per game doesn't really get you there. I put him at 210 because I think he has a good enough year this year, again on volume, that people are still sort of talking themselves into him in the late second. You have him all the way out. What do you see for Naji Harris in 2022?
I actually think he's going to have a pretty good year. But again, that kind of year that reinforces these same narratives where the upside probably isn't there. And, do you feel comfortable paying at that level? The same kind of thing we talked about with Austin Eckler, where Eckler could have a committee in 2023. I think that Naji Harris is someone who makes more sense to kind of have the backup that Javonte Williams is stuck with than Williams does, for example. And if you add that in for 2023, then I think he could be a 3rd or 4th round pick. I don't think that there's any reason why Harris would need to be drafted way ahead of where we're seeing guys like Travis Etienne and Cam Akers go this year, for example. It's not to say this guy is toast, although, I mean, there's some Trent Richardson concern here as well, where it's just the overall explosiveness is not at the level that really helps the team. Now, again, I'm not saying that I think that's going to happen. I think he's going to be like a 3rd round pick next year. And I think probably a solid 3rd round pick, somebody who, because once we get into the dead zone-ish area, some running backs are actually getting dropped to prices that you kind of like. I could see him being a good pick in 2023. But I think that the evolving ways that fantasy drafters are looking at running backs and looking at drafting in the first 2 or 3 rounds could work against him. One of the things that we're seeing this year is that the pass catching backs are really being favored. I don't know that he's going to get as much of a boost from that, especially if George Pickens is as good as it looks like, especially if Pat Freiermuth takes the next step. Those guys are not running the same routes. They're not doing the same kinds of things. But when you look at how the passing offense could work, the design could benefit the receivers, the tight ends a little bit more than the running backs. One of the things here is just that still, I mean, there's a very good floor for Naji Harris because the Steelers don't really have other backs that they can use. Anthony McFarland looked good in the first preseason game. He's never really been somebody they were willing to rely on in the regular season. They do have an undrafted player who has been making noise in camp. It looks like he could be the backup. So we have some players who could factor into this backfield a little bit, but it's still going to be Naji Harris. I just think that he actually needs a good season this year, like a dynamic season, a talent-based season to maintain himself in the first 2 rounds.
or else he's a 2023 dead zone running back.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to get yourself stuck there with Elijah Mitchell and Antonio Gibson. And Antonio Gibson illustrates what happens. You get in the dead zone, and even your real life coach knows, and then you fumble, and you're done.
You're done. Naji Harris, 2023 dead zone running back. I actually kind of like that take, even though I had him at 210 here. But yeah, he was the last running back that made it in for me. I had 9 total running backs as well in this exercise, 6 in the first round, 2 more in the first 5 picks of the second, and I snuck Harris in. But we have that same similar dynamic that we're talking about. But going back to the receivers, after Higgins and Diggs, who we both have at 208, 209, you finish Adams, Gabe Davis, and Judy. After Higgins and Diggs, for me, it's Naji Harris, Cortland Sutton instead of Judy. And then my co-212s that I referenced were Devontae Adams, and I had Mike Williams in there. He's the one I didn't want to drop out. Probably makes sense to drop him out. The case for him fairly straightforward, right? We've talked this offseason about him and Keenan Allen. He's the guy that I think unlocks the big season for Herbert. If you're going to stack up Herbert, I think you want to stack him with Mike Williams. He's got the contract now that he'll be there with the Chargers, with Herbert. Keenan Allen's yards per target type metrics, his targets per run started to fall a little bit. I think we just see some more of that. I do think the Chargers probably add another receiver next year. So it might be the case that Williams is not actually viewed this highly, even if he has a big year. Maybe they go get a first-round receiver next season. That wouldn't surprise me very much if Keenan Allen does fall off a little. But that's the thought on Williams. The more interesting one to close out our second round is these 2 Broncos receivers. I have Cortland Sutton 211. You have Judy 212. We both obviously are seeing some positives from the Broncos team. We were very excited about Javonte Williams in our round 1 show. The market agrees with me here, Sean. The market thinks that Cortland Sutton is the guy for Russell Wilson's skill set, his extended plays, his deep throws. I don't think there's a lot that I need to do to explain Cortland Sutton at 211 that's not already explained by ADP and a lot of the work being done looking at 2022. The far more interesting discussion is you having Judy here, not having Sutton here. What happens in 2022 that makes Jerry Judy the 212 next year?
This is a little bit of a gamble on how I think that upside seasons from these 2 players would be perceived. Now, one of the things that you note with Mike Williams, I agree completely. He's one of my first players out. The issue that he could have is that he's a little bit of the opposite of, say, a Chris Godwin, where he's actually a little bit older than people might realize. And, once you start to have that big season and there's more attention, people are going to ask, can we go right back to the well if he's in this particular age range? Maybe that'll hurt him. Maybe it won't. He does have a chance to have the big season. With Cortland Sutton and Jerry Judy, I think that the odds are that Cortland Sutton is the higher scorer here. You read a little bit what the Broncos beat writers are saying. They seem to be in agreement that when Russell Wilson needs to complete a pass, that Cortland Sutton is the guy. There has been this sense that Jerry Judy, again, is flashing as this incredible route runner, but it's not necessarily translating into the kind of practice production that they would like to see. It doesn't really matter how good your routes are. If you aren't producing, you're not producing. And that could be an issue with Russell Wilson, where maybe he's not the kind of quarterback who benefits from the really sharp routes as much as he benefits from someone who really gives you that vertical upside. Now, one of the things that's interesting with Judy is he actually was an air yards superstar as a rookie, just none of the passes were complete. And so I think there's the potential for him to be a little bit more of a deep threat than is being priced in. KJ Hamler is a threat to either of these guys, depending on how the offense really develops and if he can be healthy. I mean, my understanding is that they took him off PUP, but are still not practicing him with the full group. And so, if you're drafting a lot of Hamler, you're not necessarily liking to hear that. And yet, they're targeting week 1. He's a threat to both players. I think that the way that this offense works out most likely is that Sutton is the guy who scores the most points, that Judy has a solid season, that Hamler has some big plays, and that we go into 2023 with still questions about, who's the starting tight end and how are the receivers going to do in year 2 with Russell Wilson. But if it flips and Jeudy is the better of the two players or outproduces Sutton, I think that because of the difference in where they were drafted, the difference in how recently they've been seriously injured, and that probably shouldn't be a big piece of the puzzle for Sutton at this point, but still something that people are aware of, and the different ages, and then how people see that potentially manifesting in 2023, that Jeudy just has to have the same kind of season that we're sort of thinking for Sutton to be a clear-cut second-round pick. I think that if Sutton leads the team but doesn't blow everybody away, then he more or less gets drafted in the same spot that he is this year. Yeah. Maybe moves up 5 or 6 picks.
That makes a lot of sense. That was a great summation. I think you're right. I think you made a great case there. If Jeudy is the one that outperforms, he's probably easier to see in the second round. So that does it, Sean. We recapped the whole first round at the end of last week's or the previous show. The whole first round here for you was Mark Andrews, J.K. Dobbins, Austin Eckler, Drake London, Jalen Waddle, and Deebo Samuel in the top half. Starting the bottom half of the second round, A.J. Brown, a clear first-round player, T. Higgins, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Gabe Davis, and Jerry Jeudy. For me, it was Mark Andrews, Travis Kelce, Travis Etienne, who was in your first round, Jalen Waddle, J.K. Dobbins, and DJ Moore. In the first half and in the back half, Chris Godwin, T. Higgins, Stephon Diggs, Naji Harris, Cortland Sutton, and then my co-212s, Devontae Adams and Mike Williams. The near misses are pretty interesting, Sean. I wrote down quite a few more than you, but I had Treylon Burks, I had Drake London, Sky Moore, I had Garrett Wilson, and Elijah Moore. Basically just throwing a bunch of these rookie receivers there, and I think you described very well in this show why we should be viewing London probably more favorably, and I probably should have had him not on my near misses, but in my second round. I also threw Romeo Doubs in there kind of for the giggles. Ken Walker, I threw on there. If he has this big breakout year, I thought I might see him on your near misses, but you could see his profile playing up if he looks like the Seattle starting running back next year and has a very strong year. Rachaad White, I threw on there. Look, Leonard Fournette's contract, pretty strong through next year. But if he does get hurt, I think Rachaad White could have such a big season this year that we might be talking about him as a second rounder next year. My veterans were Deontay Johnson and A.J. Dillon. Again, the conversation about Aaron Jones's age. Maybe A.J. Dillon just looks like the guy for them next year. Why don't you talk about your near misses?
I have DJ Moore. I think that the ceiling is just still not where we need it in a Baker Mayfield offense. And, they could have another new quarterback and a new coaching staff next year. But for all the reasons that you described and that we both completely buy into, I mean, at the very worst, he's got to be a near miss. I mean, he's an elite talent. Treylon Burks, Elijah Moore, Cam Akers. I mean, I understand why he's going where he's going. I would have him a couple spots earlier just because I think that you can get an advantage in a meaningful one structurally if you hit on a dead zone running back and he produces similar to those top guys. I mean, you can put some of those receivers in there. I think the receivers where he's going are pretty weak, but I understand where he's going. I don't think that his situation has actually changed that much from where he was a 1-2 turn player last year. Now, most listeners will be like, what are you talking about? He had a really serious injury. I think that there's reason to believe that because he came back so quickly, you're getting both parts of it, right? Number one, you're getting the sense that he actually recovered very nicely. And number two, you're getting a discount because he did not play well during a stretch where you should have assumed he wouldn't play well. But again, running backs are very risky there. Could certainly be wrong. And then Rashad Bateman, he did not do what we were hoping as a rookie. He did deal with some injuries last season, and injuries knock down the efficiency level for all players. It's going to be additionally difficult for rookies and for players who are playing with backup quarterbacks. And so a variety of reasons why maybe he didn't flash the talent that we were looking for the same reasons that I think Mark Andrews is a better pick than he's being given credit for this year. I think that Rashad Bateman is an absolute must draft at his ADP. And if he has the kind of season that is almost dictated by the volume and the lack of other players in that passing game, then the 2-3 turn is going to be in play for him next year.
You have him as a must draft ahead of Elijah Moore, I still think ahead of Devonta Smith, ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown. I still think he's too pricey among the year 2 receivers.
I think the talent level is there. And I mean, that you and I believe that is going to drive the volume as opposed to the context being the number one thing that drives the volume. It's not that we ignore the context, and not completely ignoring the context, or what I see as potentially being the context, is why I guess I just think that his floor is so high, because I don't really see any scenarios in which he has a Garrett Wilson that takes him out, or that he has and just like the contrast between those two offenses too is I think that the Ravens are going to be much more effective. The Jets, you say maybe it's just 2, but you made a good argument about Corey Davis, and can the Jets even do 2 players? I mean, that is a question there where I don't think it is really for the Ravens. Amon-Ra, man, he's a must draft as well.
Yeah. But
DJ Chark, TJ Hawkinson, DeAndre Swift, and one of the things that I think is unfortunate at this point is that it doesn't really look like Jameson Williams is draftable. He's not really draftable in best ball because you can't burn the roster spot. I mean, if you're playing for the $1 million and you feel like you've drafted the perfect team, maybe, you take that late round plunge and just say, I can make it all the way through to where I need to be. But he's also tough in redraft because in redraft, you need the roster slot flexibility to churn, right? So it's frustrating that he may not be draftable, and yet he could hit Amon-Ra exactly when you need Amon-Ra to play the biggest. And so
I agree with all that. That's a good point. I have Williams at wide receiver 64. I just pulled up my list. That's lower than he's going. I have him behind like David Bell, but I'm right there with you. I think he's a really tough pick in any type of redraft format. Obviously, somebody we're excited about in Dynasty or Best Ball. But yeah, that's a good point about Amon-Ra, where he could then still come back and be a problem at the end in the fantasy playoffs for Amon-Ra's production. Yeah, interesting one. You also had Mike Williams on there, which you mentioned. Dropping out of this year's first round, out of our top 24 for next year, I had Derrick Henry and Austin Eckler. You had Travis Kelce, Henry, and Naji Harris dropping out of this year's second round. Dalvin Cook, Alvin Kamara, Tyreek Hill, Aaron Jones, Joe Mixon, Mike Evans, both of us identical on that list. And then I also had Deebo Samuel dropping out of my second round. Any thoughts?
I think that some of those players are going to still be in. As you mentioned in the intro to the first show, we projected some very talented veterans dropping out of the first round, and in some cases out of the first 2 rounds for this year. And we're wrong about that. We'll be wrong about some of these names. I think that Derrick Henry is actually pretty interesting when he falls into the mid-second, and depending on where you're drafting, you may be thinking, well, that doesn't happen. But we've certainly seen that in some drafts, and I would consider him there. I think that this year, one of the things you're actually getting is the opposite of what we have seen, which is that some of the run-oriented running backs are actually a little bit undervalued when you look at what their overall EP profiles are going to be. And so I think that you could win there, but Derrick Henry for me is similar to is similar to Travis Kelce, where he's going to have to absolutely crush to not have a similar fall, but even greater than what he did this year, going from 105 to, the turn. Next year you're going in round 3. Maybe you're going in that Ezekiel Elliott range. But I do like him. I do like Dalvin Cook and Alvin Kamara for this year too, but they were not nearly as efficient last season. They do have some off-the-field stuff. That off-the-field stuff could end up hitting them in 2023. But in a similar way, I think that they're probably early third-round picks next year as opposed to clear-cut top 2-round guys. And one of the things too, and this is a little bit of the dynamic with Elliott, after you fall out of those first 2 rounds, the dead zone can really punish you because people don't want to tie themselves to what they perceive as a lack of upside. in rounds 3 through 5. So those backs could hang in the mid-second, but there's a lot of threat for them to go much, much later. Is that the way
it's going to be really interesting, this group of Henry, Eckler, if you throw him in there, Cook, Kamara, Aaron Jones, Mixon. Some of those guys are going to be 5th-round picks, 6th-round picks next year. Absolutely. It's going to be interesting to see that class of, already 27-year-old running backs as they age into next year and the year after. Probably some of those guys are not going to be in the NFL in a couple of years is the other element of it as well. You're right that we're going to be wrong on a couple of them, but there's this big class of players that's going in the first couple of rounds at a running back position where there's some risk there.